Pastors thinking about a post-COVID church. I have enjoyed 2 visits to Korea and have been amazed by the vitality of the church in Korea. You are an inspiration to so many of us. Additionally, I have taught many Korean and Korean American students at Duke and have gained a deep respect for the distinctive quality of Korean Christianity. It's an honor for me to be with you as we think about our tasks as pastoral leaders in the present moment. We are in the sort of moment that Christians face from time to time. An event occurs, something dies, there is loss. We are hit with some tragedy, and we find ourselves asking, what time is it? What is the meaning of present moment? More specifically, as Christians we ask, I wonder what God is up to. That's a question that modern people are trained not to ask. The modern world is uncomfortable with the possibility that our human actions are not the only actions and that we are not the masters of our destiny. And when we inquire about God, entering into and shaping our time because of what we know in Jesus Christ, who is just about all we know for sure about God, we are bound to ask, are we at Good Friday or at Easter? Are we at an ending or a fresh God-given beginning, defeat or victory? So there is a sense in which when asked, what's going on now? Or what does the future hold for us? We are being quite truthful to answer. God only knows. God only knows because God has not left the course of history up to us. Nor has God created us to be those who control the future. Which means that thinking like a Christian always means learning to live with lives out of our control. God only knows. But because of what we know for sure about God, we can venture some expectations, suppositions, and expectations about the present moments and our future with God. After COVID, I think we ought to be careful in ascribing anything positive to a pandemic. COVID is a virus. It is a perfectly natural biological process that can kill human beings. But that's all it is. There's little to be learned about God or ourselves from a virus. Besides, we don't want to give honor and glory to a virus. They should only be given to God. COVID can kill us, but it can't determine the significance of our lives. Only Christ can do that. So, in thinking about a post-COVID world and church, we don't want to let COVID determine our thinking. For most of us, this has been the most demanding, challenging moment in our ministry, requiring us to rethink where we are going in ministry and how our congregations most need us to lead. Our thinking is determined by Jesus Christ, and here are some things that I think Jesus has been teaching us in the present moment. First, we have been confronted by our finitude and mortality. There's a new sense of the fragility of life, said the pastor to me. Well, good. We are amazing creatures who are creatures, animals who are born, live, and then die. The modern world deludes us into thinking that we are in control, competent to handle anything that comes our way, immortal. No, we are mortal. If increasing numbers of people have had that truth driven home to them, good. Second, and yet, depending on how you feel about your country's response to COVID, it's also been a time in which our illusions of control and human dominance have been magnified. If we can just get organized. If we can put enough money into this, science will save us. Our idolatry is always active, sometimes even making otherwise good things into idols. I don't know about Korea, but some of us in North America have learned how fragile our churches are. Mainline Protestantism has been in precipitous decline in the US. That decline has been accelerated by COVID. Average age in my denomination is 63. Did I say more? We were already in decline before COVID, but we masked and denied much of that decline. I expect that my denomination will lose at least half of all of its congregations in North America within the next 10 years. With loss comes fear, grief, anxiety. All that has been accelerated in our denomination and in many of our congregations and pastors. You'll have to tell me if the same is at work in Korea. Even if a congregation survives, it's hard to see how the congregation can go about being church in exactly the same way as before COVID. Some of our churches have been exclusively online for most of the past 2 years. Many pastors report that many in their congregations are saying, I've got all the church I need staying at home and watching a preach or worship on my laptop. My people are not returning to church after COVID, report many pastors. We have done such a good job of producing technically adept online worship that we have converted people into thinking that online church is actually the church, said one pastor. Our presentation of Christianity as essentially personal, private, individual, something just between me and Jesus has caught up with us. People actually believe, and I think they have now proven that gathering is optional to the Christian faith. Among some churches, there is a feeling that the pastor in the church did not manage COVID well. There is the perception that rather than try to adapt and find new ways of keeping connected, the pastor just hunkered down, glad to be free from the cares of the congregation, glad not to have to do weddings and funerals, and glad to be alone. Our pastor, whether she intended to do so or not, just seemed to act like it didn't make much difference to her if we were there or not. We got the message. We won't be coming back. Being the church during lockdown and isolation took lots of creativity, new thinking, and hard work. Some pastors showed they just weren't up to the task. And yet, because we have a redemptive God who loves to raise the dead, to make a way when there seems there was no way, to refuse to let death and sin have the last word, we are surprised to find ourselves in some ways at Easter rather than Good Friday. It's never over until God says it's over. Because you and I are called to work with God. A redemptive God keeps making ministry more adventurous and interesting than we could make it ourselves. Therefore, this could be one of the most interesting moments in your ministry. It's as if we are being driven back to the core of our ministry, the central abiding purposes of the church. Be honest, some of the things that we did as congregations were not essential. We are therefore in a time of loss, or perhaps more accurately, a time of pairing in which we are pruning the vines. Some of us grieve the loss of beloved programs and ministries. Some of you didn't have much invested in those previous ways of doing ministry anyway, so you're not in grief if those older practices and institutional forms disappear. I, for instance, am glad that I don't waste so much time driving to and from church meetings. The meeting is more efficient on Zoom. If there's a shortage of finances and my denomination can no longer afford to pay people to sit at a desk at some church agency, is that a loss or a gain? It's a time not only of pruning what's not essential, but a time to reclaim what's essential. Many of our congregations could only do one ministry during COVID lockdown, preaching and worship. From what I've seen of the Korean church, you already are centered on preaching rather than on pastoral care and caregiving. Perhaps in the present moment, God is driving us back to our core, to what the church does that no other human institution does. Proclaim Jesus Christ and Him as Lord, inviting all to come forward and follow Him, sending them out in His name. It's good to be reminded that some of our cherished practices are rather new in the history of the church. Pastors or preachers before we are organizational managers, therapists, or advice givers. I believe the future belongs to those pastors who learn how to lead in ways that are supple, adaptable, flexible. We must be quicker to adapt and modify what we've been doing in order to be fit for a new time. We must be more flexible, not only because of events like the pandemic, but also because we serve a living Lord, an active Holy Spirit. If your ministry was heavily invested in nurturing, preserving, and protecting church traditions, I think this could be a tough time for you. On the other hand, if you enjoy asking, I wonder what God is up to now and how can we hitch on to that, it's a wonderful time to be a pastor. If you are heavily invested in the present organizational mechanisms of the church and can't imagine church different from the church that produced and nurtured you, then you have got something reimagining and retrofitting to do. Pray for courage. It's so much easier just to maintain what we inherited from the hard work of previous pastors than to rethink, risk, attempt to work with the Holy Spirit in birthing the next church God has in mind for us. Pray that you'll be given the courage to risk difficult conversations, to say truth that nobody wants to hear, to cast a vision beyond present arrangements. I have faith that God will answer those prayers and that some of you may find this to be one of the most invigorating, adventurous times in your ministry. As bishop, I often interviewed pastors who were retiring and I asked them, what do you most miss about your days in ministry? Most of them responded, I miss the funerals. That sort of surprised me to hear them say that. Funerals. I think that they meant that when they did funerals with all the loss, death, and attendant grief, they felt needed more than ever. People needed someone with the courage to say what needed to be said. People badly needed someone to go back in the scriptures and the tradition and bring forth some truth that needed to be said in the present moment. That's what God may be offering us in the present time in ministry after COVID.